Our sponsor for this session is GR Energy Services, completion, production, and water management. Please visit their page in our Sponsor Showcase tab.
What are the areas of reckoning, as our keynote speaker, CNX Resources President and CEO, Nick Deluliis, likes to call them, that Appalachian Basin producers will have to address in the coming years? We'll hear about three in particular. Can the industry afford to operate on an unwritten policy, so to speak, of quietism, as Nick likes to call it? And what exactly is that? You're about to find out. When it comes to the Appalachian Basin, few executives are as experienced as Nick. He's been with CNX dating back to when it was Consol Energy for more than 30 years. So he certainly knows the lay of the land. With that, it's my pleasure to welcome our keynote speaker, Nick Deluliis.
Well, thanks for the kind intro, and you're right. This is an interesting time within the basin, and there's a lot of different things we could choose as a topic to discuss today, but I did want to focus on that concept of reckoning, and that does have a number of different components tied to it. But before we get into really three areas of reckoning that I think are crucial today and playing right out in front of us, I want to first talk about the success story that the Appalachian Basin has become, and it's become an epic success story. It's not necessarily a new story. It's maybe unique and new to our industry with the components that are attributed to it, but it's happened many, many times in many other industries. And you can see that in everything from the assembly line with Henry Ford and automotives, PCs, microchips, software, media, et cetera. And just to put those things in perspective on what a success story this has been and how it's been replicated before, at one time, after basically Henry Ford showed up on the scene, there were over 200 United States car manufacturers in existence. Now there's a lot fewer, of course. With PCs, I think a lot of you remember Gateway and the cowhide boxes that would become delivered in, and a consolidation, a fallout, those types of things that occurred after that epic success on the PC market. Microchip, similar story. Software, a lot of you remember QuatraPro, which was eventually overtaken by packages like Excel and Microsoft. And with media, who can forget going to the Blockbuster stores on the weekend on a Friday to pick up the movies that you'd watch over the weekend and then return on a Monday or return it in time without the late fees. All of those things in their own ways were disruptive and very successful, changed the landscape of their industries and beyond. And all of them also resulted in ultimate reckonings and falling outs and more of an equilibrium that had been reestablished once the technology came on the scene. That's the story, I think, of American ingenuity, of innovation, of the free market at work. It drove all those things. And that disruptive technology and that theme of disruptive technology came into play once again, this time in our industry with Appalachian shales. And it basically, disruptive technology, that is, it cracked the code. We always knew that the methane, of course, was in the shale deposits, but we didn't have a technology or a process that would be able to liberate it in a economically feasible manner. Disruptive technology through horizontal drilling, through completion technologies, it liberated that methane molecule at really prolific rates and at really low costs. And that has changed everything. And when I see everything, I mean everything. So you think of what has changed regionally. When you look at this region of Eastern Ohio, Northern West Virginia, Western Pennsylvania, the natural gas industry has revived the middle class. There's no doubt about that. And the middle class is what made this region great and will make it great in the future. It's also resurrected manufacturing. There's big examples of that, of course, with the cracker facility being built in Beaver, Pennsylvania, but there are other many examples of manufacturing's revival and resurrection. From a CO2 environmental perspective, we've been able to decarbonize the state of Pennsylvania. I don't know if many of you know this, but if Pennsylvania were looked at as a standalone developed nation of its own, it would be the only nation in the developed world that has already met its Paris Climate Accord targets, largely on the back of natural gas, as our grid converted from coal to natural gas. And it's helped the tax base. Okay, we're a net generator of tax revenue in our industry and our industries, and that's a good thing for local municipalities on through to states and nations. It's changed things nationally. A lot of those same metrics that I talked about regionally also hold true nationally. When you look at things like decarbonization, when you look at net impact on tax base, and when you look on what's driving and growing the middle class. And then it's obviously changed things in a big way globally. Our industry has done everything from broke OPEC's back to it's giving geopolitical security to countries like Poland against aggressors like Russia, with respect to Japan and India when it comes to China and the Chinese Communist Party. And when you look at areas in terms of what we're doing with bringing the poor of the globe out of abject poverty, a tremendous amount of impactful consequences that are derived from our industry. So that's the story of our industry. I think it plays out in some really interesting dynamics. I just sort of went across the globe with some of those, but I also want to bring it back home to your typical person that works within our industry, that man or that woman who might be working in the building trades, might be a boilermaker, might be a steam fitter, waking up in the morning, going to work in our industry, maybe helping to extract methane from the shale deposits, maybe helping to process it, to transport it, to construct facilities for it. The impact that that individual has, if you're looking for professions that really make a difference in the quality of life for millions or perhaps even billions across the planet, this is the industry to do those types of things. They're helping to liberate that methane molecule in Eastern Ohio or Western Pennsylvania, Northern West Virginia, and that methane molecule can be utilized a number of different ways from locally to globally to improve the human condition. This is the greatest story I think that's never been told, and we need to go tell it. This is a very noble industry with a great noble endeavor behind it. Now, with all that success leads to a re-equilibrium that needs to be established, like we talked about with those prior industries, and we're going to be no different. And that's the reckoning component that I really want to focus in on today. And I think there's three big areas or components of the reckoning that we need to think about and work through and navigate through. The first one is financial. You can't be, in my mind, optically sustainable until you are financially sustainable. And when it comes to financial sustainability, Appalachia, we may have a bit of a problem. And that problem, I think, really, in some ways emanates from certain realities that we need to start to accept in our decision-making and in our strategic planning. The first reality is gas price reality. And there may be a great sort of bull thesis for natural gas north of $3 for a sustained period of time, and I'm certainly hoping for that. But the reality is that we're in a sub $3 market, and we're going to be in a sub $3 period possibly for a significant period of time that stretches upon years. So looking at that forward strip when it comes not just to Henry Hub, but also to the Appalachian Basin, and assuming that is going to be the reality for us in the coming years, I think it's a much more prudent approach than hoping for developing a hope strategy where gas is at $3 or higher. There's also a cost reality that we need to think through. Costs, this is a commodity business, like it or not. Being a low-cost producer is absolutely essential. And there is a significant spread in terms of operating cash costs within the basin. Just use my company as an example. We're sitting at 70 cents an MCF on an operating cash cost basis. That compares to about $1.30 for the peers on average. Why do we have and enjoy a low cost differential between what the peer average might be? A lot of different reasons, but a big driver of it is that we control our midstream assets. So from a gathering and a processing and a compression perspective, we've got complete flexibility to allocate our capital and adjust our activity set as situations dictate, as factors and inputs dictate, versus being tied to minimum well commitments or minimum volume commitments or things like costly firm transportation, et cetera, or expensive gathering rates. So that's a tremendous advantage for us. It's a big driver with respect to cost structure. Cost structure matters incredibly when you're in a commodity business. And just to put these costs in perspective, of course, there's a lot of different sort of drivers or assumptions when it comes to ultimately what your all-in costs are. But there's a lot of talk about dollar per foot on the capital side of drilling and completions activities. And looking at a $10 per foot differential on the capital side, that's equivalent to somewhere under a penny on an operating cash cost basis. So if we're at 70 cents and the peer average is $1.30, that 60-cent spread, that's equivalent to over $600 per foot on a capital efficiency side of the equation. So operating cash costs matter tremendously. That also impacts your inventory. If you've got low operating cash costs, that helps define what is economic inventory at a $2.50 gas price or at a $2.25 gas price deck. So it also impacts inventory and depth of inventory. Another reality, I think, is capital intensity. There is obviously a lot of capital intensive investments that we need to make in our industry, or industries when you include midstream. And when you look at the level of activity that's required to, let's say, hold maintenance flat year in and year out, the ability to do that with lower capital intensity, less activity, that bodes really well for the sustainable financial performance of the firm or of the company. And there's a big spread with respect to what it takes to hold maintenance flat for different peers as well. Again, using us as an example, we need somewhere around 25 tide line wells per year to hold our production flat. We feel that gives us incredible strength when you look at our financial sustainability into the coming years. Then there's also all these other things beyond where the rig and the frac spread are operating at. Things like unused firm transportation, things like interest expense on debt. And oftentimes these things get looked past when you're looking at certain financial metrics or ratios, but they are really not sort of at liberty to decide whether you pay them or not. They're not discretionary. You've got to pay your interest expense on your debt. You've got to pay your taxes. You've got to pay things like your unused firm transportation capacity, whether you're using it or not. So from our perspective, those things matter quite importantly, and we always factor those into our decision making when we're looking at what our actual cash costs are. Now, when you start looking at these different realities on the financial side, the gas price reality, capital intensity reality, operating cash costs, unused FT, interest expense on debt, all of those things, they all culminate in free cash flow. That's ultimately the metric that matters in this business. Who's got positive free cash flow? Who doesn't? And that's not the same as EBITDA. It's quite different actually in this type of an industry. And it's not the same as modified free cash flow. It's a pretty simple metric. All the cash in minus all the cash out over a period of time. Who's got positive free cash flow and who doesn't? And this metric of all important free cash flow, it's only going to grow in importance as time goes on. And it's going to grow in importance to both creditors of our industry as well as the equity holders in our industry. You can see it in different examples. You can see it in RBLs, in credit facilities themselves on the credit side of the equation, where those syndicate banks are going to want to see and want to lend to and commit to entities that are free cash flow positive on a sustainable basis. You're also, of course, going to see it, and you're currently seeing it on the equity side, where equity holders increasingly are clamoring for a return to shareholders, and not a return to shareholders 2 or 3 years from now conceptually under a $3 or $3.50 gas price world, the return to shareholders now under the forward strip reality. So free cash flow isn't going away anytime soon from our perspective, and it shouldn't. Now, tied to this and the concept of financial sustainability is the transparency that goes with it. We've got a responsibility in this basin to transparently disclose to our equity holders, to our employees, to our service provider partners, and frankly, to our communities, what we expect to do with respect to our endeavors, our activities, and our businesses in the coming years. Right now, again, by way of example, CNX has a 7-year guidance out there for the world to see. Production, costs, capital, and ultimately, of course, free cash flow. That allows a lot of different stakeholders that we work with and partner with to make logical decisions off of moving forward. That's important. That's a duty that we feel. But if you look at the industry average right now, instead of 7 years, we're probably looking at something closer to a 7 weeks worth of guidance, basically between now and year end. So even for 2021, transparency is not where you need it to be to really put forward a sustainable financial plan. And frankly, an industry and an ecosystem from an investment perspective that's going to thrive. So talk is cheap, right? But let's show everybody the numbers, what we're capable of doing individually and as a basin and as an industry beyond the next 7 weeks. So that covers the first sort of reckoning, the financial sustainability reckoning. Let's jump over to number 2, the second bucket, which is more in the M&A camp. This, of course, as a lot of you know, it's been all the rage, all the talk the last number of weeks and months. A couple of thoughts, maybe a couple of hard truths when it comes to M&A to offer them up for what they're worth. First, early movers in M&A sort of trends, they are typically the losers, while the patient ones are typically the winners. We've seen this in industries outside of our own. I'll point to the banking sector right before and during the financial crisis. Those that moved quick and moved in a big way, like Bank of America with Countrywide, again, as an example, they suffered some consequences because of that. Those that were patient and waited and navigated through that astutely and logically and rationally, like JP Morgan, they basically were the winners when it was all said and done. I think that's going to be true for our industry as well when you look at the opportunity or the potential for M&A. Another thought on M&A is that sometimes it's a convenient opportunity to gloss over or address problems that the acquirer may have looming. So whether it's balance sheet, whether it's free cash flow outspend, whether it's cost structure, whether it's lack of depth of inventory, those issues can loom quite large. And if you're looking to address those, M&A often can gloss over those problems. Now, the problem, of course, with that M&A is that the equity holders of the acquirer ultimately pay the price for fixing that problem. But that might also be something that we're seeing looming large with respect to the clamoring for M&A in our basin. Also, another thought, and this is pretty basic, pretty simple, M&A, when you're taking a company with one set of significant looming problems and combining it, let's say with another company with a set of looming problems, maybe different, maybe the same types of problems, that creates a bigger entity, but that bigger entity still has looming problems. So M&A combinations matter, of course, and combining one entity with another where there's challenges tied to both of those entities creates a combined entity that still has challenges. And then, of course, sort of a corollary to that, combinations via M&A for a strong company combining with a company with looming problems, from the strong company's perspective, that can create a weaker combined entity or a combined entity with problems itself. So you don't want to inherit those problems. And then last but not least, on the synergy front, look, synergies, they can be real, no doubt about that. They can be legitimate, but a lot of them I'll also tell you, and I think you know this, when you're looking at M&A synergies and what's sort of warranted up front when the deal is announced, they can quickly evaporate and never materialize once everything settles out and you've got a combined entity moving forward. They're quickly forgotten in many instances. So there's the concept of M&A and just some sort of general rules of thumb that we try to employ when we think about and contemplate what we want to do. There's also this thought we hear quite a bit too, right? The concept of scale or getting bigger through M&A has inherent advantages. Again, I think when you look at that getting bigger or scale for the sake of scale, there's, again, data that sort of question that thesis and data within our own industry. I'll point to Chesapeake in the past, also point recently to Gulfport, both of which employed a bigger, a scale type of an approach via M&A, and both of which ran into issues subsequent to that strategy being executed. And also this concept of industrial logic. We hear a lot about that in the M&A reckoning world. And I think industrial logic is a little more interesting than scale for the sake of scale. We think of industrial logic with M&A not in the context necessarily of horizontal integration. So, getting more acres, more production, more wells. To us, for the sake of that, doesn't seem to be a big value proposition via M&A. But with respect to vertical integration, there could be value there. And that's one of the biggest reasons why we were making the move not too long ago, a couple of months back, to take back in all of CNX Midstream, our midstream MLP that we had controlled prior as a separate publicly traded entity. The ability to get that midstream integration with our upstream activities, that's a big driver, as I said earlier, of our cost structure, a big driver and sort of a competitive moat, I'll call it, of our financial sustainability. So vertical integration via industrial logic might have and warrant some benefit and some thought. But the horizontal one, sort of difficult or more challenging to see where that value might be. Now, reckoning number 3, save maybe the best for last. Call it ESG, call it sustainability, call it advocacy. It's really all those things wrapped together. And when I sort of kick off my thoughts on this area of the reckoning, I want to throw out just some beliefs or some core tenets. One, I'm assuming that natural gas is a noble industry. I said that earlier. I'm going to hold that assumption. 2, I'm going to assume that our industries, we improve the human condition and the environment the world over. We do that regionally, we do that nationally, we do that globally. And then my third sort of truth that I'm going to hold is self-evident, is that we're not a bridge to something better. Our industry is the future. We are the foundation of the future. Now, I hope you would agree with those three sort of self-evident truths and those three assumptions that I'm making. And what's strange about our industry is that even though we may all agree with those three, you really don't hear many of us advocating those three. And this is really one of the only industries that I can think of, despite the impactful nature of what we do, where we almost apologize for what we do on a regular basis. And we need to be a better job of being an advocate. So this was the political quietism that Len spoke about earlier. And what does that mean? That means, keeping your head down, keeping quiet, going about your business, hoping that you don't draw attention to yourself or the wrath of whoever the naysayer might be. But that political quietism is a recipe for disaster. And frankly, it's very short-sighted. It's short-termism to its worst from my perspective. Advocacy and advocating for what we do for society, what we do for economies, what we do for the middle class and to build it and sustain it, that is long-termism. That's long-termism at its best. And that's part of our jobs, at least from my perspective and from my opinion. There's also a couple of areas out there or statements or beliefs that we really need to have I think a much more thorough discussion with others beyond our industry when it comes to advocacy. So one is this concept of zero carbon. Zero carbon and the thought that an economy or a nation can run on a zero carbon sort of concept, that is a fallacy. That defies the laws of science, particularly the laws of thermodynamics. And this is coming from a company or an individual to work for a company that just over 10 years basically decarbonized our footprint by over 90%. So I'm a believer in that. But the thought of an economy or a nation running on zero carbon, our nation and economies that do well, they run on the backs of carbon, not in spite of carbon. And even EIA, which has done numerous studies under different scenarios and whatnot, even EIA shows that as time marches on, the demand for natural gas and the demand for carbon is the future. It's going to grow. Another type of assumption that's out there that I think we need to challenge is this thought of renewable energy, truly renewable energy, particularly wind and solar. And that renewable being renewable in and of itself and zero carbon. Neither are true. There is no such thing as renewable energy in sort of the world of science and math and engineering. And when you look at wind and solar, they can have incredible life cycle carbon footprints. So I'll use the example of Pennsylvania. And if Pennsylvania wanted to construct or install 650 megawatts of baseload capacity, if you compare a wind answer to that or solution to that versus natural gas fire generation, it's not even close when you look at the carbon footprint. Natural gas enjoys a much more efficient carbon footprint on a life cycle basis, apples to apples basis, than wind. And the reason is to develop the wind turbines for 650 odd megawatts, you need almost 300 of them. You've got to mine all the minerals that's needed for it, typically in places like Mongolia with an incredible carbon footprint tied to it. You got to process all those minerals with an incredible carbon footprint. You've got to manufacture the turbine blades and the pillars and the structures based off of carbon. You got to ship it here using carbon. You got to clear out all the pads on the ridge lines, all the trees, pour all the pads. It's an incredible carbon intensive endeavor. You got to run all new transmission lines from all those turbines. And then you've got to basically create backup that is reliable on an instant notice when the wind doesn't blow, which is typically going to be something like natural gas or coal. So the carbon footprint on a life cycle basis for something like wind in Pennsylvania on scale, on a 650 megawatt scale, is incredibly high compared to what it would be for natural gas, which is effectively going to need only 6 to 8, say, deep Pennsylvania Utica wells that could feed a natural gas combined cycle turbine on a brownfield power plant that used to be a coal plant very close by. The answers between those two sort of options when it comes to carbon intensity is pretty clear from our perspective. We got to get the word out on that and get the message out on that to people that are making policy decisions today. And then also in the world of ESG, right? That's a big area, a big topic of discussion under sort of this third reckoning. There's this debate going on within our industry. Is ESG better served with scale or is ESG better served with focus? And from my perspective, best in class ESG goes to focus. I'd much rather have focus than scale. And the reason I think that is not just because focus drives results, right? You watch what you manage what you watch, but also the corollary in sort of industries like ours, whether it's manufacturing or extractive industries, scale has not been a proxy for good ESG performance. And I can point to BP, I can point to what goes on or what went on with BHP and the mine failure in Brazil. I'm sorry, the dam failure in Brazil. We can point to different examples on the utility side, with Pacific Gas and Electric being one that's front and center today, with what happened with the California wildfires and rolling brownouts and pending bankruptcy that subsequently happened because of it. There's many examples where scale is not the silver bullet, unfortunately, for great ESG performance. Focus is the silver bullet for great ESG performance, whether you're small, large, or middle-sized. And then I also want to talk about the S in ESG. A lot of attention on the E, a lot of attention on the G for governance, not a lot of attention on the S for social. We think quite a bit about the S when it comes to ESG. Our company is 155 years old. We're the oldest publicly traded company in this region. And we are from this region, by and large. We want to remain in this region. Our parents, our grandparents are from this region. A lot of our parents worked for our predecessor companies. Our kids live here, and God willing, we want our kids to continue living here. So these communities are more than just areas we operate within. We want to hire locally. We want to spend locally within these regions and these communities. And we want to set targets, much like you would with carbon targets, much like you would with other types of targets that you set out under ESG. We want to set tangible targets with respect to how much of our hiring, how much of our spend is going to stay within these regions, and particularly, right, within these regions where communities are more economically distressed versus others that are doing quite well. That's about as impactful and as ESG friendly as you can get. So don't forget about the S in ESG. We want to be champions of our communities. If we're going to be champions of our communities, putting our money where our mouth is, the performance is going to follow and Wall Street's going to follow. Finally, I just want to wrap up just basically asking for leaders to stand up and be committed to our region. Again, we're from here. This is really important to us. This goes beyond the dollars and cents. We're not looking to basically flip an investment opportunity, get in, get a return, exit, move on to the next opportunity. This is where we started. This is where we want to end. We constantly think about this over decades worth of time. The next generation, where's this company going? Where's this industry going? How is it going to benefit the region? And the last thing that I would sort of tag ourselves as are rent seekers, looking again for a quick return or the way to make a quick buck. The more of us that take that approach, I think, with respect to Appalachia, the better off this industry is going to be and the better off this region is going to be. And by the way, I'll leave on this note, there's a big implication here when it comes to sort of sustainability, ESG, and that side of reckoning. When you look at our demand, we're manufacturing a wonderful widget that impacts society with the methane molecule. And left alone, under a free market system, the demand for that product is going to grow. But if we don't do a good job in this last reckoning that we spoke about, there are naysayers out there that are working night and day to make sure we never get the chance for that demand to grow like it would. And the two examples I can give you that unfortunately are in front of us right now, one's on the East Coast and one's on the West Coast. Boston, we all know how difficult it would be to get a pipeline built right now into New England, and particularly into Boston. When it gets cold this winter, where's Boston going to get some of its natural gas and its energy from? It's going to get it from Russian LNG. That's not by accident, that's by design. We've got to go combat that with facts and with logic and bring to the table and advocate for everything that we do for society, including New England. The example on the West Coast, I mentioned Pacific Gas and Electric. That reflects years and years of consciously moving away from solutions like natural gas and embracing so-called renewables to the point where maintenance wasn't being invested in, practices weren't being kept up to best in class. And before you knew it, a really bad thing happened with dozens of fatalities. And now you've got rolling blackouts occurring in California on a regular basis. It's basically become a third world grid. That wasn't by accident. That was by design. We've got a duty to combat those types of poor informed policy decisions and advocate for what we do for a living, because not only is it noble, the rest of society is counting on it. I want to thank the Doug audience. I hope you had a great Thanksgiving. I think we're gonna have a really interesting end of year here. We only got about a month left, but based on what 2020's looked like so far, don't count out a really active December as closing out the year. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Nick. I do have a couple questions for you. first one I want to ask, we are obviously talking a lot about natural gas at this conference. We're at Doug East. You mentioned it's not a transitional fuel, which seems to be the conventional wisdom, or even, I don't know, in some ways the industry has kind of just let itself be put there. Why do you think natural gas won't be a transitional fuel? In fact, what'll be the catalyst that turns that conventional wisdom around, do you think?
Well, two questions there, right? Why do I think it's not just a bridge and a transitional fuel? And then the second part of your question is what would catalyze a realization of that? The reason it's not just a bridge or a transitional fuel is just science and engineering. When you look at the demand for energy, the demand for energy is going to continue to grow nationally and, of course, globally. It will grow globally more than nationally. It tends to track and correlate to a GDP type of a metric. And that's a good thing, right? As energy access and demand grows, life expectancies go up, infant mortality rates go down. You look at education and individual rights, they flourish. So really good things happen. Economies and individuals, they want access to reliable energy. When you look at the solutions that are out there, basically coal being piece of the energy solution has been drastically reduced through the years. I think that trend will continue. Nuclear, right, has its issues, especially nationally and in developed economies. So if anything, that looks to be in a decline, some level of a decline curve in terms of capacity over time as more plants that come up for recommissioning or not recommissioned. That basically leaves natural gas, wind, and solar. And as we discussed, when you look at wind and solar, they are not what I would call sort of repeatable, consistent, reliable answers on scale. If you want to put a single windmill in somewhere or a solar panel, certainly they'll work. And solar in Arizona or wind in certain offshore locations, I'm sure economically makes sense. But at scale and across a wide footprint of a nation or of a region or of the globe, it simply is not an answer when it comes to scale. Also, on top of it, it doesn't solve the CO2 targets or ambitions that we may have as a country or as a region or as a planet. So when you're looking at the CO2 footprint and the carbon intensity of wind and solar, as I said earlier, those carbon footprints are much larger than what people let on. And the reason is you're only looking at the carbon footprint once the turbine is installed, right? And once the wind is blowing. Well, that's really not the true carbon and CO2 impact of what it took to get there. So I just think it's basic science and engineering. And last time I checked, math and science and engineering are undefeated. So ultimately they will prevail. Now, what catalyzes that? Unfortunately, I think what catalyzes that is situations like Pacific Gas and Electric, right? Where things reach almost a breaking point and a realization in very stark terms that this wasn't a good informed policy set of decisions that we embarked upon. And you get to the point of rolling blackouts, or you hit the switch and the light doesn't come on, or suddenly power goes out in the middle of winter. That certainly would be a catalyst to get things back to an informed basis. I'd love to be able to get there before those types of catalyzing events. And I think the best way to do that is for this industry and the leaders within it to step up and be heard.
Great. And let's go to that. You're I believe you're a member of the bar, so maybe you're a little bit more well-spoken in defending the industry. I'm not sure. But how do leaders, what can they do, especially the ones with not a lot of resources? I mean, faced with the ones that would duck their heads down. Like, how do we get them to get out there and tell this story? Natural gas and fracking were a big part of this election, so and we need to change that story. How do they do that?
I think there's a local component to that, and there's a larger picture to it. On the local component, Pennsylvania is really a good exemplar of what's happened in a short period of time. If you look at 10 years ago, sort of during the land rush phase and the early stages of, say, the Marcellus and the natural gas industry, a lot of people just in Pennsylvania were sort of, I call it disinterested. They didn't know it was something interesting, but if you weren't a farmer in the rural area that had a lease, or you weren't working in the industry itself, it largely it was something you were hearing about, but you just didn't know. As time marched on, and the industry was able to repeatedly show economic viability with the extraction methods, right, of what we were going after in the Marcellus and then ultimately the Utica, then all of a sudden you saw further capitalization. Pipelines were being built. Manufacturing was starting to pop up. more and more people that were employed in the industry weren't just growing in numbers, but they were from here, right, from the region. Restaurants were suddenly popping up, hotels, service sector areas where everybody suddenly figured out this is a big foundational piece and driver of our economy. And suddenly the realization went on that this is a tremendously good positive thing for my little community, for my Western Pennsylvania region, and for the state overall. And you even saw it sort of migrate from Western Pennsylvania, Northeast Pennsylvania, down to Philadelphia, right, of all places, where entities like the pipes that we would build with Mariner to Philly to take it to Marcus Hook and take ethane production to Norway or to Scotland or wherever it was going. Again, suddenly wider parts of the state started to see the benefits of this industry. So there's the local story to that. Just having your neighbors understand how part of what they derive as economic value is driven in part by a foundational piece of this economy called natural gas. There's a bigger picture to this, right? The bigger picture is more getting the math and the science on paper. Let's see apples to apples what the true carbon intensity is of wind at scale in Pennsylvania, let's say, versus natural gas generation at scale in Western Pennsylvania. And when you look at not just the carbon footprint, but just the environmental footprint overall, with respect to surface disturbance and everything else that goes along with it, it's not even close. When you look at the energy security aspect of it, it's not even close, because much of this, whether you manufacture the components of a wind turbine offshore or not, many, if not all, of the base materials, we don't have them in our country. So we're going to have to get those from offshore sources. So across those metrics, I don't think people understand that that's the case. I think they do believe that there is such a thing as truly renewable energy, a truly zero carbon economy, and that you can just sort of magically plop down wind and solar at scale in places in Pennsylvania and have the same affordability, reliability that natural gas fire generation would offer you.
Right. So let me ask you about M&A a little broadly, because you brought it up. And a lot of those early movers you were talking about, a lot of that's down here in the Permian. You haven't seen a whole lot in Marcellus, Utica, or even the gas plays. Is that something, do we need to see consolidation in the Marcellus and Utica are there too many players, I guess, at that point right now?
So like you said, M&A and our conversation commentary earlier, M&A is front and center everywhere you look these days in our industry and in our basin, not just like you said, to the Permian, but also within Appalachia. Yeah. Obviously, M&A depends, right? It always depends. There are undoubtedly synergies that will be created with combinations. There are also dyssynergies that are created in certain instances, or those costs of the combination can take quite a long time to overcome with any perceived synergies, real or not. But again, looking at it from the perspective of what drives success in this industry, it's only a couple of basic things. It's, do you have a deep enough inventory to continually, consistently manufacture a methane molecule at a cost that allows you a healthy margin, a cash margin under reasonable price decks looking forward? Okay, so looking at M&A, assuming a $3.50 gas price world, that's not what we're looking at right now. Or contemplating M&A where the cost structure of one or both entities doesn't work from a rate of return or even from a cash margin perspective based on those forward gas price views. That's not, in my mind, exciting M&A. Also, looking at whether or not you can do that and ultimately generate free cash flow. That's another big component to that. And do you have a balance sheet that's going to allow you to take advantage of the free cash flow that you're generating? And to me, those are the key sort of pillars of a successful, financially sustainable E&P midstream entity in Appalachia. And if you look at a lot of the M&A that you're hearing about or being bannered about, that type of M&A really doesn't address the cost issue. It really doesn't address the inventory issue per se. And it doesn't seem to address the free cash flow / balance sheet issues. And they're not going to go away unless and only if gas prices rally. So again, from a reckoning perspective, if the NYMEX and Appalachian Basin prices are what they are for December of 20 and for all of 2021 and 2022 and 2023, there has to be fundamental change that, from my perspective, M&A will not address.
Okay. Well, I'm going to let you go, Nick, but I got one final question because I'm looking out the window behind you, and I don't know, I'm a Pittsburgh native, by the way, stuck here in Texas through the COVID. So I'm missing it. So how's the weather been?
Well, this is a good news, bad news. So as a fellow Pittsburgher, looking at, this is being taped in late November, right? So it's not early December yet. Maybe it'll change by the time Doug airs. But for late November, the good news is it's quite nice.
Okay.
The bad news is it's quite nice.
Yeah. I know.
So that's why, if you're looking at the impact on demand and what gas pricing might do here year end and into 21, so far the start to winter and the end of fall has been quite mild.
All right. Well, happy wintering then. Maybe I'll see you in the spring.
When you make it back up, give me a ring. We'll get together.
Thanks a lot, Nick. Thanks for being here.
Thank you.